What's going on, everybody? Good afternoon. We are here on this Tuesday, still waiting for stuff to happen, still waiting for more information. Tuesday tends to be kind of the slow day of the week for football stuff anyway. You got no practice, you got no injury report, typically anyway. So, since we've got a little bit of free time right now, I wanted to talk about a topic that I've been spending more than a little bit of time thinking about lately, and I think that there are a lot of Seahawks fans that are kind of wondering about this as well as we go through this 2024 season. Um, how long is John Schneider's leash right now? And it's obviously a question that has a right answer, but we don't know what that answer is, and there's no way for us as Seahawks fans to know. The people who know would be Jody Allen and the people that Jody Allen listens to when it comes to the Seattle Seahawks and how they conduct their business. And the reason why I ask is because over the last few weeks, and look, when the team loses, I understand that everybody kind of takes a turn getting tossed into the fire. I understand that everybody's going to be a little bit negative on everyone when the team loses. And a 3-game losing streak is, I mean, in the NFL, that's a big deal, right? This isn't baseball. A 3-game losing streak in baseball means very little, but in football, it means a lot. So I get it. I understand it. A lot of the players have been beat up over the last 3 games. Coaches have been beat up a little bit. I think we're a little more lenient there because the coaches are new. But what about the guy who's been there forever? What about the guy who's been there every step of the way over the last, we're coming up on what, a decade and a half? How long is John Schneider's leash? And I think this is an interesting question because what you're really asking is when Pete Carroll got fired back in January, and he was fired. I know they called it a promotion or demotion or a move, and they tried to frame it in the way of, oh, he's still here. He's just not gonna be the head coach anymore. But they fired him, and they found a way to phrase it in a way that didn't sound that ugly. But when that happens, and the GM that has been there every step of the way since Carroll arrived, they both basically arrived at the same time in 2010. Does the clock reset and John just get a brand new lease on life? Or does he get held to that same standard as Pete with maybe a little bit more of an opportunity to dig out of it? And I think the one reason, some of the conversations that people use when they talk about Schneider, and I've seen a lot of it be negative lately, and I think the central point that people are trying to use is this team is kind of devoid of superstars, right? We have stars, but we don't have superstars. I feel like as of this moment, the closest thing that we have to a superstar player is probably Ken Walker. I think people would be calling him a superstar were it not for the injury that he had this year. Like, this is his third year, looks poised to have a big breakout. He's putting up great numbers as is, even with the games that he's missed. He's doing some awesome things out there, super skilled, super talented. I think if not for the injury that he had this year, I think people would be calling K9 a superstar. He would be clearly a top 5 back, maybe even a top 3 running back in the league. And to me, that would be a superstar. But other than that, you have some close calls. You have some guys that are maybe on the way, but I don't think we can quite say it yet. Guys like Charles Cross, guys like Devin Witherspoon, maybe Reek Woolen. I think there are too many deficiencies in Woolen's game for him to ever be considered a superstar. But as of this moment, yeah, we are one of the teams in the league that has a lot of talent. There's a lot of good stuff going on this team. A lot of things that I'm excited for, a lot of young players that I think are going to get better. And we do have a couple players that I think are headed towards superstardom. And we have a lot more players that are maybe more in that stardom role or stardom path. Excuse me. It's not bronchitis, by the way. I had a couple people ask me if it's bronchitis. It's not. It's just allergies and a lingering cough from the cold that I had a couple weeks ago. But you can't say that Schneider has done a great job keeping the talent cupboards stocked over the last decade plus, I would say. I mean, we've spent plenty of time talking about how poorly the Seahawks drafted from probably 2013 to 2021. They had one okay class, the Frank Clark, Tyler Lockett class. And even that was just okay, and everything else was bad or terrible or kind of a joke. So, the question is, and this is the thing we'll never be able to answer until somebody writes a tell-all book, and then we're going to have to trust the book. How do you separate the John Schneider GMing experience from the Pete Carroll GMing experience? So, we know that when Pete Carroll was the head coach, he was also head of player personnel control in Seattle. Pete Carroll was ultimately the one who could decide, who could make final call on any personnel choices in Seattle. He could make final call on draft picks, free agency signings, re-signings, cuttings. He was in control the whole time. Maybe that last year or last 2 years, he relinquished it quietly behind the scenes. But for a vast majority of his tenure, he had personnel and player control. Now, some people have argued, oh, he never actually exercised his personnel control. Schneider controlled everything. I've heard some people argue, oh, he only exercised his, he only pulled rank on Schneider once. I saw another person say, oh, I have inside information. Carroll only ever pulled rank on Schneider 8 times in the history of him being the head coach for the Seahawks. So what I'm trying to say is nobody actually knows. I've heard a lot of people throw out numbers of like, oh, it happened this time and that time, but not any other time. I'm not really buying any of it. I know that some people are trying to ascribe some kind of a number to it, but we'll never know what the actual number is. We do know, just off the top of my head, that Pete Carroll did exercise his rank, I guess you could say, like I said, pulled rank on Schneider in 2021 when Schneider wanted to trade Russell Wilson to the Bears and Pete put his foot down on it. Other than that, we just don't know. But just because Carroll doesn't exercise complete control over the roster at all times and does let Schneider do his own thing a lot, doesn't change the fact that he's got some pull in there. I mean, there are famous stories in the Seahawks front office about how their scouting department would put all this work into building a big board for the draft every year, and then Pete Carroll would just go in there and start screwing up their board and moving names around based on his gut. And the scouts didn't like that. They were like, hey, we put a lot of work into putting that big board together. We've done a lot of research that we know you haven't done because you're too busy being the head coach. And you're just reorganizing things based off of your gut feeling. So how do you separate yourself completely from that, even if he's not necessarily like putting his foot down on you and saying, no, you have to do this? How do you separate yourself from that? I think the answer is you probably don't. I think you probably can't. I think you just kind of have to accept that he permeates every decision you make at least a little bit, sometimes a lot. But on some level, he's going to have an impact. So that's the part that makes this really hard, right? Because everything you could say about Pete Carroll failing to get this team over the top for the last almost decade of his tenure, not even sniffing the NFC title game, could also be said about Schneider, right? You could say that Schneider wasn't able to get the players in place to get the team to where they were talented enough to get that deep. And again, you're trying to separate one guy from the other, and you're trying to figure out who to blame for this, who to blame for that. I think the clear difference is, and I think maybe this is where Schneider got a reprieve and Carroll didn't last offseason, was Schneider was the impetus behind the Russell Wilson trade. Generally speaking, people in the know, and this was said at the time, this is not something said in hindsight, was that John Schneider was sick of Wilson and really wanted to trade him. He wanted to trade him the year before. And Carroll initially was fighting against it. He didn't want to do it. And he didn't really so much as agree with Schneider at the end that he wanted to trade Wilson, so much as he just eventually threw his hands up and was like, well, okay, fine. I'm not going to fight it anymore because Wilson wanted to get traded. And then that trade goes down, and it's one of the greatest trades in NFL history. We restock our draft pick cupboard. We use those picks on a lot of, at the very least, good players, right? We've certainly gotten some good stuff out of it. And Wilson goes on to be one of the worst quarterbacks in the league over the next couple years. And now he's effectively out of the league, and he may never play football again. So I think that a big reason why Jody Allen decided I'm going to fire Pete Carroll, but I'm going to keep John Schneider, was that Schneider was the reason why that trade happened. So I imagine that if she's trying to make a decision on keeping one of those two guys, that's how John Schneider wins that argument. He's like, I wanted to trade Wilson. Carroll didn't. Not that he would go in there and say that. I think that would probably be a little over the top for him. I don't think he'd be that mean, but that would probably be the tiebreaker. Of course, you don't have to break the tie. You could fire both. But the thing is also for me, we haven't gotten to see the fruits of those draft picks' labor fully bloom yet, right? Charles Cross might be in the middle of becoming a superstar. As of right now, he's playing like a star. He needs to keep it up over a longer period of time, but he may blossom into a superstar left tackle. Devin Witherspoon may blossom into a superstar cornerback. It's too early for these guys. We can't say anything about them yet, I don't think. This isn't like a DK Metcalf thing. I think fans are justified in believing that DK Metcalf will never be a superstar because he's been in the league so long. He's just a star at this point. Right? I mean, it is what it is with a guy like DK Metcalf at this point. He's a star, but he's not a superstar. Same with maybe a couple other players on this team. Like Geno Smith will never be a superstar. Maybe if the circumstances around him were right, he would be a star, but he's never going to be Josh Allen. A guy like, I'm going to say, and look, Woolen isn't even really a great example for this because he's a 5th round pick. You've gotten mondo miles out of the dude, but he's probably never going to be a superstar either. I think he's capped out at a star because of his limitations in run defense and tackling. Maybe Boye Mafe never becomes a superstar. If I had to guess, he won't. He can be a star. But even that, like, this is his 3rd year. We don't know for sure yet. I want to see if these picks that he spent from the Wilson trade end up turning into something great before I judge him. I still think the door is open for some of those guys. Even a guy like a JSN is only 22 years old. I don't think he's going to be a superstar, but I don't know for sure yet. But the way in which John Schneider approaches things like free agency, like, I don't know who you pin the Draymond Jones contract on, but that's obviously been a disaster. He's tried a couple times now to find ways to, like, patch the holes here and there on some positions, like the offensive line. A little bit this season we've seen with linebacker. It doesn't seem like it's working all that well. Offensive line, obviously, has mostly been a disaster. There have been a couple times in Seattle's last decade plus where he's successfully, like, patched the hole on the offensive line. The 2018 offensive line was good. The 2020 offensive line was good, but it was temporary. It was built on the back of mediocre players having a career year or older veterans having the last great season or two in their career. Guys like Dwayne Brown, guys like DJ Fluker. So he hasn't been able to find a long-term solution there. And then you have the trades, which, look, the Leonard Williams trade, I think that's a good trade that ended up looking bad because of Carroll's inability to get the team to win after the trade. I don't really put that on John. I think John made a good trade, and Pete was unable to cash in on that good trade because they weren't able to put together a very many wins after the trade. And that's not on Leonard Williams, right? Leonard Williams is a really good player, worth the trade that we made for him. It's just one of those things where he wasn't able to single-handedly right the ship, and how many players could. And I think that's more of a Carroll thing than a Schneider thing. But the trades have not been as lucrative other than the Wilson trade lately. And then that gets back into the Carroll argument. How do you separate Schneider trading for Jamal Adams from Carroll trading for Jamal Adams? Who instigated that? Who wanted that? Who thought that was a good idea? Who wasn't able to negotiate the Jets down to one first-round pick and maybe another third-round pick or something instead? Who wasn't able to walk away from the negotiation table? Now, from what I know about John Schneider and knowing he comes from Green Bay, I really don't think he wanted to trade 2 first-round picks plus for a box safety, but I don't know. And I think that it's really hard to presume that there's any way to know. Who's going to admit to that? Who's going to admit to making one of the worst trades in Seahawks franchise history? Who's going to admit to instigating and pushing for the Adams trade at this point? Nobody. I'm sure if you ask Schneider in a private, he'd say it's Carroll's fault. If you ask Carroll in private, he'd probably say it's Schneider's fault because nobody wants to own that. So what I'm trying to say is, did Schneider reset the clock when he survived the Carroll purge? Because, the funny thing I always said, I'd say the last 4 years of Carroll's tenure in Seattle, last 4 seasons, the thing that I always said was it felt like he was playing a game of Survivor where everybody else was going to fall on the blade for the team not achieving what they want to achieve. And he was eventually going to be the only one left. He was going to be the guy who won the game of Survivor. As it turns out, John Schneider won that game of Survivor. Because everyone else got pushed out, right? Ken Norton, Brian Schottenheimer, Russell Wilson ended up kind of getting pushed out. Many other assistant coaches, by the way. I can't even remember all of them. You could even make an argument somebody like Chris Richard got pushed out for his failures. Although I didn't want to fire Carroll at that time. I don't think very many people did. And you could probably go down the list of some other players that got pushed out of here that kind of bought Carroll more time. Guys like the Legion of Boom. To a certain extent, you could even go with Bobby Wagner getting pushed out at the same time Wilson was. And it felt like Carroll was going to win that game of Survivor. Schneider ended up winning it. But what I'm wondering is, do you think that John Schneider gets a reset clock when he wins that game of Survivor? Or does he just get a stay of execution until the next time the team falls short? Because there's no one else really left to blame if you're trying to blame somebody for why the team hasn't made the NFC title game in 10 years, right? He's the only guy left from that entire tenure. All right. Let me know what you guys think down below. See you guys later. Go Hawks.